with that, let me kick off the next in our series of Alliance of Angels webinars. We're really proud to have IntuitiveX give this one. I'm going to start by, I won't do a background of the Alliance of Angels because as I look through the list, well, no, I guess about half are not members. So the Alliance of Angels is one of the largest and most active angel groups in the Pacific Northwest. Been around 23 years, have done invested about 250 million and about, I'm sorry, 150 million, about 250 companies. Have had a series of exits through the years that leads to an internal rate of return of over 20%. We're currently at about 150 members where we are capped, and have typical year looks like 10 million invested in about 20 to 25 companies. So that's about the pitch for the Alliance of Angels, and now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing my friend Jeff Rowe. Not often that, you know, you often talk about people and say, oh, he's a brain surgeon. Well, Jeff really is. And on top of that, he's not only an MD, but an MBA, great investor, and has started a company, IntuitiveX. And I think today is going to be a really interesting webinar, and I see we already have a lot of people on board. So with that, Jeff, the stage is yours. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. Really appreciate it. Want to welcome everybody to this workshop. So yeah, we were asked to give a workshop on life science investing. And I know that this topic tends to be a little bit of a black box to some people, understandably. And so we're going to try to distill it down and keep this really just very informal. The first half of it will be kind of a presentation by our team at IntuitiveX to give a little bit of background on how we became to consult with folks within the life sciences, both on the startup side as well as the industry side. Next slide. So this is kind of the agenda for the hour. We'll kind of introduce ourselves, who is IntuitiveX, and then we'll talk about this methodology for assessing life science companies. And this is also a great way to actually assess for life science companies that you may be looking for as a potential investment opportunity. And so it sort of behooves everyone to understand how we take a look at our sort of investment thesis for companies that we invest in. Then we'll give you a couple of case studies to sort of highlight our sort of investment strategy in Amplify Surgical as well as AltPep. And then finally, the latter half of this is going to be essentially just a Q&A session, starting off with a brief panel session, then just open it up to any questions and answers that you may have. Next slide. So I'm going to take a step back before I let my team members introduce themselves by sort of giving you a story about how I got into life science investing and then life science startups. As Dan mentioned, I am also a practicing spine surgeon. I'm a director of minimally invasive spine surgery at Swedish Neuroscience Institute, and I do that on a part-time basis. But my primary job for what I do, like my mind share is really invested in IntuitiveX, which is a life science consultancy and incubator based in South Lake Union. You know, this slide kind of just is an intro slide. It takes grit, vision, and resilience, right? And what happened with me is that during my training, I developed a minimally invasive laser-guided approach to place in spinal implants through small incisions. And so I tested and validated this model in a cadaveric model, taught some residents and fellows how to do this approach, and then protected the IP. Then once the IP was issued, I went around to the different implant companies. And initially I got a lot of rejections, and it was very humbling because I had no idea what what it took to actually take an idea from concept to commercialization. But luckily, there was a company that actually believed in the vision that I had through this IP, and that was Stryker Corporation. So Stryker believed in the vision, acquired my IP, I assigned it to them, and subsequently I got on 3 separate surgical design and innovation teams. And essentially what I did was I worked with their developers and their engineers to transform their open surgery platforms. And by open, I mean really big incisions, where surgeons will essentially fillet open the spine in order to actually see what they're doing with their eyes. But I had a vision of actually being able to do the same type of procedures through small incisions where you didn't have to strip off the muscles, tendons, and ligaments. In essence, it was like building a ship in a bottle. So I had the opportunity to work with our engineers to develop the products. And then we took it through the FDA through a 510(k) clearance pathway, got it approved. And then once it was approved, then we took it to different parts of the world. They flew me to Europe, to Asia, to Australia with their sales and marketing team to teach other surgeons how to do this new procedure. So it was very eye-opening. So that was on kind of the established kind of industry side. So, I cut my teeth doing that for many years. And then in 2009, I had an opportunity to join a biologic startup company down in Southern California. And the founder was a very smart biomedical engineer who developed this proprietary technology to take growth factors that have been proven to help bone to heal, including one called bone morphogenetic protein, another one called TGF-beta, and bind them onto dead cadaveric bone. So I took a look at his basic science data, and then took a look at some of the animal studies that he'd done, and it looked very promising. So I agreed to help him out. I was the first person that actually joined the company, primarily as an advisor, but also as someone who would help guide the executive team. Brought together a group of angel investors, closed our seed round, then brought together a group of scientific advisory board members. And these are subject matter experts in the field of biologics and surgical biologics, osteobiologics specifically. And then they wrote some papers, and we published some white papers and helped them to grow the business. And we had a successful exit about 4 or 5 years later. So that was really fun to see. And then we realized that the industry was changing. And that's primarily what we tried to address through IntuitiveX, is that the industry about 10 or 15 years ago used to be where these big companies like Stryker, Medtronic, J&J, Zimmer Biomet in the medical device, ortho spine space, and other companies, big companies in the Fortune 500 listings in the pharmaceutical and biotech sectors, where they used to really be good at innovating internally. So they used to have very large budgets for their R&D, but that's changed over the course of the last 5 or 10 years, whereby now they look for acquisition targets. They look for de-risk companies that have taken their technology through the FDA, and then they've de-risked from a financial perspective by generating revenue in a number of cases before they look to acquire these companies. So essentially, we try to address the needs both on the entrepreneur startup side by affording entrepreneurs and startups an opportunity to develop their products and to be sufficiently de-risked for them to be acquired by some of the larger players. And on the industry side, we try to address their pain point by giving them access to deal flow in these companies that may fit very well into their own portfolio. Next slide. So essentially, we think about this in a kind of a 4-legged stool model, where you may be able to get rid of one of the stools and it may be able to stand, but it may be a little bit wobbly. But if you take away 2 or more of these legs, there's no chance that this stool can stand on its own. So we try to address the clinical, the IP, the scientific, and the business components of all of these ideas and startup companies, and really take a deep dive into each one of these legs of the stool. And so that's how we're gonna be able to present some of this information to you today. You know, I'll represent the clinical side, and then can you go to the next slide? Mark Han will address the IP and legal side. Amy Chen will address the scientific side, and then Albert Choi and Emeka Alozi will address the business side of it. So if you wouldn't mind going back one slide, Albert, and then I'll sort of let Mark introduce himself, and he'll pass it on to Amy.
Sure, thanks, Jeff. So this is Mark Hahn. I've been practicing IP law for the past 20 years. For the first 10 was with boutique IP law firms representing actually predominantly high-tech clients. So my background is in electrical engineering, and I represented clients such as Microsoft and Hewlett-Packard and Seagate and so forth. And then after that, that's where I started to learn more about the business side and the valuation of IP. And then I went 4 years in-house at a local company here called Intellectual Ventures. And this was more back in the market has since evolved a little bit, but back in 2010 to 2014, there's a lot of high-profile deals, and especially with Intellectual Ventures and my team, we helped manage that. And so our fund, we managed about 30,000 assets, and it was a great experience learning the business and the valuation side of IP and how it's important, especially to not only big companies, but especially startups. And then after that, I managed Ivy as a client for a firm, and then shortly thereafter, I helped co-found IntuitiveX with Jeff and our partner Simon. So I'll pass it on to Amy.
Hi everyone, I'm Amy. I'm the scientist of the group. I'm a bioengineer and a scientist previously at Verily Life Sciences. I worked on primarily the diagnostic and therapeutic programs, such as a nanoparticle drug delivery program. I also co-founded the extracellular vesicle liquid biopsy program there. I have a bachelor's of science in bioengineering from Berkeley, and I subsequently did a master's in applied bioengineering from the University of Washington, really focusing on tech commercialization, particularly for the healthcare space. So at IntuitiveX, I am the Director of Client Services. I evaluate the technologies and the startups that come to us for help. I help determine their needs and gaps in their commercialization journey, and I help fulfill those needs with services that we are able to provide.
Hi everyone, my name is Albert Choi. So I actually started off similarly to Mark in the tech sector. So I was working with Samsung Electronics in the semiconductor field for a while. Then I quickly moved on to more of a project management and business development role through various different consulting companies, Accenture, and a couple stints at a couple failed startups. I manage the business portion, so I represent the business portion of, I guess, today's talk. I am the portfolio company manager here. So I manage not only our portfolio company needs, but kind of sit down with them, do the road mapping, and especially from a business side point of view, kind of help drive what is required for both investing and for successful commercial operations. I'm going to be passing off to Emeka.
Thank you, Albert. I am Emeka. So I will be supporting Albert on the business side explanation. I was formerly at Intellectual Ventures, the spin-out of Zenova, which focused on open innovation and R&D for large corporations like Pepsi and Hyundai, supporting with their marketing efforts. And now I'm at IntuitiveX, helping lead with marketing and supporting partnership focused on life science innovation. I'm happy to be here and happy to meet you all today.
Great, thanks everybody. And another reminder, if you wouldn't mind, if you're not one of the presenters, can you please put yourself on mute because there's a lot of background noise. Thank you. So kind of, we'll go through these slides pretty quickly. You know, in the typical tech incubator model, you have like, you know, you work with startup companies for about 3 to 6 months. You provide some seed capital kind of in the range of like 100 to 200K. And then after that, you're done with them, you know, and then you move on. That becomes like fund number 1 with about anywhere between maybe 15 to 20 companies. And then you move on to the next sort of class of companies, and that becomes fund 2 and subsequently fund 3, fund 4. Life science is very different in the sense that the life cycles tends to be longer. The cost of capital, the amount of capital that you need in order to actually bring these startups up to speed tends to be a little bit more on average than typical tech. And so that's where we're very different, where we focus in on choosing the right companies that are a good fit for our investment strategy and ethos, as well as companies that we believe have a chance of succeeding in the marketplace. Next slide. So this is kind of our approach on how we work with all of our clients, and it's sort of it's a funnel, and at the top of the funnel is a consultancy where we provide consulting services in all those areas that we mentioned before. So we offer business consulting services in finance, operations, strategy. We offer intellectual property consulting services to help them protect their intellectual property. We offer legal services. We offer services through our clinical and scientific networks, where we can then help to test and validate a model or some technologies through our networks as well. And then what we try to do on the second level is we try to connect them early on into potential corporate partners, so that these partners have an early opportunity to take a look at some of the deal flow that we have, so that they can potentially invest in these companies as well as these companies go through the pipeline. And at the end of the day, if it turns out it's a good fit, then there may be a potential, acquisition downstream. And that's sort of how the model works today in our industries. Then the third sort of level of the funnel is the incubator. So after we've had an opportunity to work with these startup companies and having a very deep understanding of their technology and their team, and whether or not that's actually a good fit for us and a good fit for them, then we decide mutually whether or not it's a good fit for us to bring them on as a portfolio company. And then finally, that's when we can make an investment into these companies and take equity positions. So our model, business model, is that early on we get consulting fees for services that we provide for any types of clients. It doesn't matter if it's a single entrepreneur, whether it's a startup company in sort of mid-phase of their development, or whether it's a Fortune 500 company in the life sciences. We could provide these consulting services. And as these startups and entrepreneurs actually go through this funnel, at the end of the day, we, at the later end stages, we can actually benefit with them as they exit and get acquired. Next slide. So we have a closed loop incubation model where it can be as early as an inventor with an idea. So it may be an idea in their head, it may be an idea on a napkin, it may be an idea that they may have submitted through a non-provisional application. And Mark will kind of talk about that in just a bit. But essentially the entire closed loop model is that we take an idea, help protect that idea, then help with intellectual property, then we help them develop a prototype for that idea, test and validate that within our own scientific and clinical networks to make sure that it works. And then we either get a thumbs up or thumbs down from these subject matter experts. And oftentimes we have also kind of a Kickstarter model whereby there's crowdsourcing of these subject matter experts. If they love the idea, then they will invest in these ideas as well. And that's how we get a very good sort of temperature or gauge on whether or not this is a fantastic idea, because we let the marketplace actually dictate whether or not an idea is going to succeed or not. And then we help them to get through FDA. Typically, we tend to gravitate more toward the 510K clearance pathway because of the fact that the barrier of entry to getting that cleared through the FDA is lower. And then our record thus far in getting a medical device approved through the FDA is 52 days. Typically, our average is somewhere between 3 to 4 months to get FDA clearance. And then finally, we get help to get it commercialized by bringing in executive team members and then helping them to raise capital, and then bringing the product or service to the marketplace. Next slide. So this slide really is to say the two areas where we can really help startup companies is they save time and they save money. You know, by utilizing this model where we have in-house experts, subject matter experts in these different areas of business, legal, IP, scientific, and clinical, that we can actually help them to sort of scale up their resources. We can function in essence as their back office, providing these services for them so that they can focus in on improving their own core technologies. Next slide. And then this is sort of our deal flow of how we get access to a really good pipeline of really innovative companies, not only through tech transfer offices, through universities, and we have a very close working relationship with UW, UC San Diego, UC Berkeley, University of Chicago, and Columbia University, as well as with companies like Stryker. We were on a call earlier today with Stryker's head of IP business development, and so they open up their IP portfolio to very interesting technologies that may not perfectly fit in with what they're looking at strategically right now, but they open it up for us to see whether or not we can build teams around that idea and help them to actually commercialize that idea. And then we also then have first degree network contacts, as well as ideas that come from internally. An example of that is a digital health platform that was built internally called Transpara Health, that came from within IntuitiveX. And then that's how these portfolio companies develop. And the number of both portfolio company service clients and non-portfolio service clients has really been expanding tremendously. Probably the fastest growing area of our business right now are companies that are venture backed in Asia that want to commercialize in the US. So we have many clients who are looking for opportunities to commercialize their really, really innovative technologies from Asia to here to the US. Next slide. So I'm going to pass this along to our Director of Client Services, Amy Chen, to talk about the Ieps methodology. Amy?
Oh, I was on mute, sorry. Thank you, Jeff. Assessing life science startups can be very different than assessing high-tech startups, and it doesn't have to be intimidating for investors. So we wanted to present our methodology for assessing life science startups so you have an idea of how to look at these type of startups and not be intimidated by it. So IntuitiveX considers 4 verticals in the life sciences: biotech, medical devices, pharma, and digital health. And while each vertical has its own challenges, they have different timelines and ROI advantages and disadvantages, we do consider many of the same factors that investors would be used to. So these would be a quality management team that reduces execution risk, strategic and advisory partners. So these might be your scientific advisory boards or strategic partners that are key opinion leaders or even primary customers in the field. Access to capital, such as demonstrated track record of fundraising. The market, so overall target market size of opportunity. The strength in their IP portfolio, and then the product and technology outlook. So even though these factors are same as those an investor might look at for a tech company, for life science companies, there are key considerations that differ either in the amount of weight that we give that factor or in the type of assessment that we do. Mainly, life science industries are innately very difficult to enter. Product development is much more capital intensive. There are multiple stakeholders involved in the actual adoption of the product. Regulatory pathways are not easy to interpret and even more difficult to navigate. And as a result, investment horizons are lengthier, and it requires a certain amount of endurance and a deep understanding of the field on the part of the investors. So when we evaluate life science companies, we actually place a heavier weight on intellectual property at an earlier stage. We also value the scientific and clinical validation of the product and technology. And we want to make sure that there is buy-in from the clinical and scientific communities in the form of strategic partnerships. In addition, life science entrepreneurs need to have a balanced approach. And this hinges on that 4 stool legs that Jeff introduced, meaning they can't just have the clinical and scientific, but they also must have the IP and business aspects of a startup. So for today's presentation, you know, as sophisticated investors such as yourselves, management team, strategic partners, and access to capital is likely a little bit more straightforward. So for the presentation today, we'll address the not so obvious success factors that differ a lot. So market size of opportunity, strength of IP, and evaluating product and technology. So to kick it off, I'm going to hand it to Mark Hahn. Mark?
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I just want to touch on the importance of IP in life sciences. As you know, Jeff and Amy mentioned, it's a little bit different approach than, you know, my previous career in high tech. So in high tech, certain startups can succeed if they're merely the first to market. So, you know, if it's a software app like on your iPhone or so forth, if you just get customers to adopt your product before others and you obtain a certain level of market share, then even if that game or app or, you know, software isn't technically protectable or it's difficult to protect, the fact that, you know, other considerations like first to market are in your favor, you know, you may still very well succeed. In life sciences, that's generally not the case. So whether it's a medical device or pharma and so forth, you really do need to protect the idea and the concept before you go to market, because it's too easy for a large pharma company or a large device company, say Medtronic and so forth, or J&J, to come along and say, hey, that's a great idea. Let's check if their idea is protected. And if not, they can easily overwhelm you and throw a large budget at it and take your idea. So in the life sciences, among the other factors, IP is an absolute necessity from the very beginning. And so some of the services that we provide is, you know, we take a look at the concept of the startup, and we're able to do, you know, freedom to operate or prior art searches and analyses to determine, listen, one is, are there any other players in the exact field that you're in? And also the adjacent sort of marketplace or the landscape to where your primary ideas are located. So, you know, one of our portfolio companies in NavLab is a very IP-centric startup company. And so it's in the medical space, involving surgery and robotics and so forth. And this is just merely a simple diagram of one layer of the type of thorough sort of landscaping effort that we're able to provide. And so, you know, if you look at this 3-dimensional sort of graph, it shows, you know, who are sort of the key players in the space that's related to yours or the startup companies, the various landscape focus areas, so the subject matter, and then, you know, on the vertical, we can play around with either, you know, number of patents or a portfolio, like IP portfolios, or, you know, valuation and dollar figures and so forth. But in this case, it's, I believe it's the number of IP assets. But before a life science startup is willing to, really start this journey and try to enter the marketplace, the IP is absolutely essential. And so, you know, we can answer some more questions later. I don't want to dwell too long on this particular slide, but basically, depending on the idea that the startup is focused on, there are different strategies for the IP as well. So a lot of times the assumption is, oh, we just want to go broad. as possible. But that's not always the case. And so there's also business considerations, because if you're always raising money, you know, you need to build a specific portfolio, and, you know, priority dates are always a concern regardless. And then also, you know, there are strategies where you want to file more than just a few patents, and each one you want to have a crystal clear and narrow sort of claim direction for each of the filed IP. But like I said, we can touch on a little bit more during the questions, but I think at this point, I'll go ahead and give control back to Amy.
As Mark mentioned, IP holds much more weight for life sciences than tech companies. So the IP assets actually need to be evaluated earlier rather than later, and it should factor into your investment decisions. And as you might have guessed, we do have in-house expertise in intellectual property portfolio management. We regularly help startups secure their IP and grow their IP assets so that their company has tangible value from the start. So we also offer services and expertise, as Jeff had mentioned, for feasibility, market assessments, partnership scoping, business infrastructure, which includes a lot of the back office support that life science entrepreneurs may not have the background or interest to deal with. So we can help startups with their financial documentation to meet the standards of sophisticated investors like yourself. And we also help with developing, validating product technologies, their regulatory and licensing pathways, reimbursement, and altogether build out a solid commercialization pathway going forward. And because we can help them with this pathway, we in turn can then help investors like yourself evaluate the startups based on these necessary components. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to dive deeper into assessing product and technology in the life sciences. This can be complex and multifaceted. So here are some of our guidelines that we consider when looking at the product side. So from left to right, we first look at the science of the technology in terms of novelty, mechanism of action, and advantages and disadvantages it might offer in terms of solving the problem at hand. We generally try to rely on the startup team's ability to explain their science and whether they have the expertise to justify that explanation. But for due diligence, we also rely on experts in the field. IntuitiveX has an extensive network we rely on when we're vetting ideas. If you're looking at a spine implant, you want to know the thoughts of a spine surgeon. If you're looking at a diagnostic device, you want to know the thoughts of a clinician who will be making decisions based on that diagnostic output. So getting the key opinion leaders validation is highly recommended. And it ties into the second point I want to make of getting buy-in from peers. So peers in this sense would be the larger scientific and clinical communities. This can be in the form of peer-reviewed academic papers, particularly if the journal is very reputable and if there might be collaborating institutions that are willing to stake their name with this company. Poster presentations also count, so particularly at conferences that are relevant for that field. So an oncology device, we would love if the poster presentations were at ASCO. For spine related, maybe NAS, and for health IT, maybe HIMSS. And there are many more conferences, but these conferences do allow startups to float their product to the relevant communities. And we actually find it very risky if the product doesn't have buy-in from their peers, meaning it likely hasn't been validated outside the company. The third point I wanted to make is the data validation. So looking at the studies and trials that they've conducted, whether that be, in vitro, preclinical, or clinical validations. So when you're looking at data validation, it's really important to look at the study design, whether they have proper controls, statistically relevant numbers, do they validate reproducibility, and do they actually validate the clinical claims that they're going for? So whether that's efficacy against the placebo, or efficacy against a competitor or the current standard of care. So the first 3 points is really about understanding the product's technology and whether it has validity for its intended application. The next 2 points, the product development and regulatory, these are heavily tied to the timeline that investors can expect going forward and how much endurance you will have to prepare yourself for. So development timelines can be affected by the obstacles and hurdles to achieving the product's intended form. So a technology might be working in vitro, but if it's intended for in-human use, so in vivo, then you'd know that the timeline is extended, and we'd want to know that the startup has addressed these developmental hurdles in order to reach the final form that'll reach the target user. Regulatory, as you might expect, is a significant hurdle. Pathways for regulatory can vary in difficulty. So Jeff mentioned that we do like 510K pathways that demonstrate substantial equivalence, and they're cleared for pre-market notification. The de novo and PMA pathways are extremely time consuming. So at this point, we would want to make sure that the startups have started a dialogue with the FDA. These scenarios are usually pre-submissions where the FDA will give guidelines, and it saves the startup time and money. The last 3 points of our guide are scalability, adoption, and future trends. So I'll briefly touch upon this because Albert will present more about market considerations. But for scalability, we consider whether the product can access scale. This can be either through enterprise sales, or if the product might be a platform that can be scaled to more applications and thus more market and more revenue. For adoption, we must consider the complex network of multiple stakeholders, payers, providers, patients, distributors, hospital economic decision makers. And we want to know that the founder has thought of all their channels and has a plan to address all these stakeholders and how the strategic play will go. And finally, for future trends, we're referring to potential competing technologies and the future trends of the product space. So if the technology at hand relies on a soon to be outdated science, the product won't be so relevant in the future. So this analysis helps us determine how the technology space might affect the product's ultimate market dominance in the short and long term. So with that, I'll pass it to Albert to clarify more market considerations.
All right, thank you, Amy. So I think one of the stark differences for assessing a life sciences business versus a startup business versus the tech industry startup business is, I guess, the notion of in the tech industry that if you build it, they will come. As outdated as that might be, the life science is a little bit stark in that if they build it, they may or may not come. And what I talk about is that a lot of times life sciences are not geared towards either consumers or even the industry as a whole. They're usually kind of niched in their focus and the segment of the industry that they operate in. And this is why the go-to-market strategy is so important. And how we assess the go-to-market strategy is that we have to recognize that in the life sciences industry, barriers are often very tall and very wide due to both incumbent players, regulatory factors, and structural barriers. And what I mean by structural barriers is, I'll touch upon this a little bit later, but in terms of the overall ecosystem and how that either technology or idea can integrate into it. And also another difference is that when assessing the go-to-market strategy, it's the exit opportunity that many startups should be considering before even entering into the market. And this is why, and this is the reason that when we see recent trends in pharmaceutical industries, medical implants, or even the medical tech industry, that we see that there's a lot of outsourcing of R&D, in that it used to be the notion that these corporations used to develop great ideas, great innovation from within, But right now, how we see the industry shifting is that most of those ideas are coming from acquisitions, from outside third parties, research firms to startups that are a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more quote unquote cutting edge. I hate to use that term, but willing to take the risk that large corporations may or may not be willing to take the risk for. The second part is that when we look at the life sciences industry, it's many physician entrepreneurs, many research entrepreneurs, and there's always a balance that needs to happen between research and applied markets. You know, we take the stereotype of the mad scientist working in his lab, you know, all night, all day, but that's actually a pretty good apt kind of entrepreneur model that you see in the life science industry, where they're so focused on the research, they actually forget about balancing the applied markets and what drives a business to be successful. And, you know, this is where we kind of see that the healthcare system and integration is so critical, in that just because you have a good product doesn't mean that the market will accept it, especially when it essentially tips or sinks the boat rather than rocks the boat. And what I mean by this is that when you have an implant, per se, that a spinal implant device that can go into, you know, it might be a life-saving feature that is completely novel. However, if you have to disrupt the entire healthcare system of how doctors operate, how the hospital systems operate, how insurance operates, the chances of success is much difficult than something that can basically kind of fit into the existing business process of the entire ecosystem, and not just the surgical, not just a certain field. And so it's a balancing act. The intellectual property, the science, the clinical, and especially the business strategy that is sometimes missing with a lot of entrepreneurs, that must be carefully balanced, the four-legged stool model again. And properly balanced, as you can see, the returns actually outperform the tech sector. So when we take a look at 2019, you know, only 1/5 of the total deal value is in life sciences, with the median deal size exceeding that of the tech industry. However, when you take a look at the 2019 returns that's adjusted for, you know, annual returns and for the failures within the life sciences space, you see that the life sciences space really outperformed the tech sector space. And one of the key driving factors is specialization. And when we talk about VCs, we talk about specialization of the LPs. By specializing and focusing your collective knowledge for intellectual property, science, clinical, and business strategy, you can achieve those higher returns. And as we can see, you know, every single exit through from Series A to Series E, the life sciences sector outperforms it. And one of the difficult parts about kind of, you know, the business strategy and getting investments and returns is crafting that narrative. It's hard to take something scientific and put it into something that anybody can understand, especially might be sophisticated investors, but might not have the scientific background. So I'm gonna hand it over to Mecca, who's gonna talk about how you can craft that narrative and how IntuitiveX, you know, gets the marketing done.
Thank you, Robert. When it comes to marketing within the life sciences, IX's philosophy is recognizing that our story is the story of every other life science entrepreneur, including our clients. We know that each life science entrepreneur has a story, and that same story that starts as an idea, beginning at conception and moving through commercialization, closely parallels our founding story. It parallels the story of Jeff, a spine surgeon who faced a lot of rejection after knocking on the doors of spine companies, until finally selling his method for a less invasive form of spine surgery to a large medical device company after a lot of persistence and perseverance. It's in going through this maze, really, of life science innovation, understanding its complexity as founders, and repeatedly going through this maze so many times through IX's services, service clients, and other engagements, we realize the more we share in the stories of our entrepreneurs, the more we share in helping them generate and capture value. And in doing so, we're able to build our brand in the process. So what does that look like from a marketing execution standpoint? Well, life science ideas are complex and difficult for the non-specialist to understand. Unless you can distill the complexity and tell a story, quite frankly, the idea will never gain traction. And that is where IX is able to help entrepreneurs craft their story. We offer a suite of branding, pitch deck, and document services for early stage life science companies as a way to support with fundraising and really help with business development efforts. For example, earlier Jeff mentioned Transfer Health. For that company, we're able to help them develop a one-page executive summary, which highlights the most important information an investor needs to know to decide if they're even interested or not in engaging with that company. We also helped develop their COVID-19 comprehensive management system, which outlined and prepared a document that provided a way to track, monitor, and identify COVID-19 patients within a hospital system, even assisted living facility, or could it even be useful for local governments as well as manage their redeployment back to work. For Partura Medical, a women's health medical device company that seeks to treat pelvic floor disorders, we help them with their pitch deck, improving their design, or reducing some of the jargon, and really helping to effectively communicate the potential of the investment more so than overtly emphasizing how interesting the science is. However, in as much as we are storytellers, not everyone has a story, or better yet, has found their story. And that is why we do our best to inspire the story of others. Through events we put on or host, we bring together the greater life sciences community, inclusive of investors, physicians, entrepreneurs, innovators, even both locally and globally. And it is through our events such as the Health Tech Summit or the COVID-19 Technology Innovation Summit that we can attest to this. So how good have we been at sharing the stories of others or even helping others find their stories? Next slide. We have received a number of press and media coverage in response. IntuitiveX in our Health Tech Summit 2019, we're able to get more than 150 people in a physical location interested and excited about supporting life science and life science entrepreneurs. The University of Washington Foster School of Business continually on an annual basis at this point invites us to help us judge them on their health innovation pitch competition. And even internationally, organizations within China acknowledge us and recognize us as an organization that should support them with identifying the right kinds of companies that should be recipients of awards and through their pitch competition. Locally, we're seeing interest from the Puget Sound Business Journal as well as GeekWire for our stories. And unsolicitedly, Collabtree nominated us as one of the top 5 life science incubators. Next slide. And then on top of that, moreover, with our COVID-19 Technology Innovation Summit that we hosted this year, a way in which we brought together public health agents, government officials, and even corporations to discuss how exactly they're tackling COVID-19 outbreak, and even some of the recent innovations that are coming out of that through the pandemic. We're able to reach out to more than 3,600 attendees, really engaging them and really getting positive feedback as to the overall event. On top of that, we're seeing other organizations mention us in the news, mention us through their publications, emphasizing that we're comparing us to the likes of Blueprint Health, which is a large healthcare accelerator, one of the largest healthcare accelerators, and Novartis Biome, which is one of the largest innovation hubs created out of Novartis, the large company. We're noticing that our reach is also extending globally. In the UK, a medical research company identified us as a tech incubator to watch in 2020. And we're seeing some of the efforts that we're having in Australia, in which IntuitiveX is helping support and invest the next Jeff Rowe over in Australia. Passing it back to Albert, I want to emphasize that through our experiences, we're very humbled to give others a voice and communicate their stories. And now to pass it back to Albert, our portfolio company manager, to talk about some of our case studies in alignment with our science, IP, business, and clinical narrative.
All right, thanks, Emeka. So I understand we're a little bit running behind, so I'm going to quickly go through because I think there's a lot of questions that have been going through back and forth to the chat window. So I think our first case study is Amplified Surgical, and this really highlights our ability to go from concept to commercialization. The story is, and I won't get into the technology, but how we assessed it was that we had 4 neurosurgeons who came us with just an idea. We scientifically validated, helped them through FDA regulation. We protected their IP along with brokering additional IP deals to really make sure that no one else can infringe on this aspect, and develop the executive team along with their commercialization strategy, investment funding, and other commercial opportunities. And what resulted was, from 2017, with just an idea, we reached around a predicted exit value of $120 to $250 million in just 3 short years. Right now, we have over 500 cases of completed successful surgeries with Amplify Surgical. So this kind of highlights that building model of the four-legged stool. The next kind of case study is going into, again, identifying the right partners and the right technology. When you talk about convoluted markets and barriers to entry, one of our portfolio companies, Alpet, is directly looking into solving amyloid diseases, including Alzheimer's disease. And they have a novel approach to combating this. And again, this is based on the clinical studies, protecting of the IP, and as well as balancing that business with not just only research, but applicable platforms that we can look into, such as drug-resistant bacterial infections and implant devices. I know this is very rushed, so please, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, or I'd be happy to host calls, separately. But we're just going to move quickly back into the Q&A.
Now to open the floor for our panel Q&A. So in this panel Q&A, I'll be asking select questions to our panelists, Jeff, Amy, Mark, and Albert, related to their clinical, scientific, IP, and business expertise. To start with our clinical expertise, Jeff, in your experience, what type of clinicians make the best kind of entrepreneurs? And what are the traits investors should look for when evaluating clinical executive teams?
I would say that there are several factors that are characteristics of successful entrepreneurs in the life science space. And I think what I look for are entrepreneurs who've had a successful exit or success in the startup world in their specific vertical, number one. And then the second factor would be sort of flexibility on how they approach problems. Because, in clinical and scientific tends to be very prescriptive, but in startups and in entrepreneurship, it requires the ability to pivot. So I think it's really important for entrepreneurs to have that characteristic. And then finally, I think that being able to think outside of the box and being comfortable with ambiguity is one that also is a really good characteristic of an entrepreneur in the life sciences, where it's not all about just the science or the clinical aspects of it. They've got to be able to think outside the box of how can they actually bring this into the clinics, into the hospital systems once it is FDA approved, to have that kind of flexibility and comfort with ambiguity.
Great response. Amy, as for the science perspective, as a scientist, new research is always being produced and is ever changing, as you know. As a result, new techniques and technologies are constantly being created. Within the life science space, how can one best discern what is novel and what isn't? And what are some best practices you use to filter through the noise?
Thank you, Emeka. And after this question, we'll open it up to let the AOA members ask questions. I want to make sure that they get their questions answered too. But so looking at technologies, determining if they're novel or not, I generally try to read papers that they have published, look at the data that they've accumulated, and evaluate the validity of the experiments. So if you're unable to do this yourself, definitely rely on a subject matter expert. And you definitely need some amount of expertise to evaluate and give it sufficient diligence. But mainly my process is understand the proposed technology, understand the mechanism of action, and make sure there's a reason that the technology actually works for the problem. I then look at technology in the similar space. What's the current standard of care? And how does the startup differentiate themselves from a technology standpoint? So Albert's case study was a prime example of this, where there were a lot of failed companies in that space, even though they are large Goliath companies. But being able to identify that ALPEP has a reason, a mechanism of action that makes sense, and why they have a chance to be successful where others have failed.
So we have a question from Dan, and the question is, the FDA process seems like a huge barrier to most non-life science investors. How should we think about this? Amy and Albert, you guys want to take a stab at this?
Absolutely. So definitely FDA process is a huge barrier. One thing to ask primarily is if there are predicate devices, so previously approved devices that are similar enough. So this is sort of the first gate. If there are predicate devices to use, then the timeline is significantly shorter because they can go through the 510K pathway. If not, then we want to make sure that the founders have a plan to start the dialogue early on with the FDA regulatory system. Usually they would file a pre-submission, especially for the de novo and PMA pathways. This is very important. Jeff, did I miss anything?
Yeah. Oh, Albert, go ahead.
So I can add that a little color from the business side as well. And this goes back to kind of balancing act. And it's the same story as the tech industry, where you have essentially your MVP or you have a low-hanging fruit. So just because you have a very novel technology doesn't mean that the FDA is going to be very onerous. It might be, but as long as you can kind of balance that out with the applied market, you would have a direct revenue channel into your technology. So for instance, we have a startup that's working on a very novel solution. It's a wearable solution for deep vein thrombosis. However, we understand that even though there's predicate devices, there's certain levels of features that require more FDA scrutiny. So how we're approaching this is kind of moving into a very kind of low-hanging fruit, very easy to get through FDA process. And then we can piggyback that off as a predicate device for a more advanced device that's more clinically focused. So it's always a balancing act, and but it's nothing that's completely unsolvable.
We have an IP question for Mark. It's from Bob. It says he's asking he said this IP mapping is very sophisticated and not something the average angel investor can do. How would you recommend an angel investor with limited resources evaluate IP? Mark?
Thanks, Jeff, and good question, Bob. IntuitiveX, obviously we have access to very sophisticated tools and platforms where we can provide, the most advanced like landscaping or prior art search, freedom to operate, and even evidence of use analyses. But if your question is basically how can your typical, investor, evaluate IP this way. I mean, there are free search services through the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, but I mean, I can't think of any, so-called sophisticated tools that are, for example, free. And that's just the case with a lot of services, right? It's, you have to go to experts in that particular area who have a developed platform that can provide these types of really sophisticated analysis, where we call it landscaping analysis, where we dive deep into the specific subject matter, the marketplace for that subject matter, and also what are the white spaces around it as well. So it's, as an investor, when you analyze a startup and its IP, I mean, it's a multi-step process. I mean, first of all, the typical investor is like, does this life science startup even have IP? That's the ultimate red flag. If they don't, then hurry up and get it, because otherwise someone else is going to crowd in on that area and steal the idea. But then just because they file IP doesn't mean it's necessarily good as well. So I mean, did they perform what Bob was asking, this type of background and search and landscape analysis before they filed, or did the inventor or the company just think they have a fantastic idea and just go blind and just file it? Because patent attorneys will do that. If you hire certain patent attorneys and they're like, listen, this is a good idea, I don't want to pay for a search, I don't want to pay for any landscape analysis, just whether it's budget or just you just don't want to, and they just think their idea is the first to the market, well then that patent attorney will do it. They'll just go in blind. They'll draft something that looks great, draft some claims, and file it. And then you may have to learn the hard way when the examiner comes back and says, you should have done a search because look, I just pulled up 10 references that predates your idea. So, you know, other than doing, you know, free searches through the PTO, sorry, Bobby, I wish I could give you, you know, other platforms that are free or, you know, extremely affordable. And we do have services that, you know, prior searches are not expensive, but for those clients who really want to vet this out and willing to, you know, pay for the professionals to do that market analysis, clearly we have those services as well. I hope that answers your question.
And then we're at the top of the hour here, a little bit over, but one last question. I'm going to put Emeka on the spot because the question, Amy answered it during her part of the talk, but it says the question from Zinchun is, for the specific 4 verticals mentioned in life sciences, what are the underlying criteria for selecting them? Are all other subtopics folded into those categories, or some of them are excluded for specific reasons? And Emeka, just from a marketing perspective, I mean, what are we looking at, and what are some of the, you know, distinguishing features of these startup companies that we look for to find the winners from the losers?
Let me read the question.
So what are the criteria that we use to select the winners from the losers, essentially? From a marketing perspective.
I would say from a marketing perspective, the kinds of criteria I look for when you're looking at digital health or pharma or biotech or medical devices is, one, whether or not when you have a conversation with said client, if they can effectively communicate with a level of confidence and diligence exactly how their specific technology or platform is competitive. And generally speaking, obviously this is a bit more qualitative a metric, but the more somebody says about what they can actually do, and when you dig in and ask more questions, more sophisticated questions, and they can answer with concisely exactly what it is the value proposition looks like or what that value proposition is capable of, then on my end, I feel like it's a worthwhile conversation to pass to Amy, Director of Client Services, to continue that conversation. Because what makes any investment worthwhile in my mind, or what makes a specific entrepreneur, somebody worth putting more sense into, is somebody who has owned and has created a level of confidence, not only about who they are, but also about what reflects who they are or what permeates off who are. And what that looks like is if there's some truth about who they are, their confidence about themselves, and obviously it's going to radiate and shine off in whatever they create. So if that exists, then you already know whatever it's going to accomplish, whether it mean a pivot, whether that mean a change in if they're doing the business model wrong, whether that means they don't have the right support, they don't have an IntuitiveX guiding them along the path. So long as they have that confidence, so long as they have the will, then it's a worthwhile conversation to identify that that's the person you should be working with. And that works across every single one of these verticals. So it's vertical agnostic, to speak. That's what I look for from a marketing perspective.
I totally agree with you, Emeka. I think like from my perspective, kind of regardless of the technology, you know, and some of the other factors, like the team or the person that's going to be ultimately selling the product, that's one of the most important things, the members of the team, you know? And so I totally agree with that. And, you know, as we finish up here, I want to thank Dan and the rest of the AOA members for providing this opportunity. Feel free to reach out to any one of us at any time. I guess some of the contact information is right there. So feel free to reach out to us. If you guys have any questions about any of the life science investment opportunities that you guys are specifically looking at, feel free to reach out to us and we can help you in that regard. If you have any deal flow, life science companies that you want us to take a look at and do some due diligence on, we'd be happy to take a look at that as well. I'm also an AOA member as well. So thank you guys so much for this opportunity, and we'll see you at the next meeting. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Jeff. And on behalf of the whole AOA, I'd like to thank you and the IntuitiveX team for what was a fabulous presentation.
Great. Have a nice weekend, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.